Yeah, hang on, this is being recorded, so
Okay.
there we go.
All right. Well, thanks, Dave. And as Dave mentioned, I work for the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. And tonight we're going to be talking about fire-influenced natural communities in central Massachusetts and the restoration and management of those communities. So just kind of a quick disclosure before we start, almost a warning in a sense. You know, I put this presentation together earlier this week, and as I mentioned to Dave, I keep going back to edit it to make it shorter, and I keep adding slides. It's such a big story to tell that the more that I look at it, the more that keeps getting added to it. So it's going to be sort of long. And on the other hand, there's so many facets of this. It's going to seem to come in at a lot of different angles at once. But as Dave mentioned, you might want to hold on to your questions until the end, because if there's something unclear in the beginning, I may come around to it later and answer it. And with that said, let's jump right into it, because there's really a lot to talk about tonight, if I can. That works. So just for some real quick context, I mean, Dave mentioned this, but I do work for the Heritage Program, and the mission of the Heritage Program is to essentially conserve the biodiversity of Massachusetts with the real focus on the rare and vulnerable biodiversity, especially species associated with the endangered species list, and also some of the more rare and unusual natural communities associated with the state. My role within the program is as the state restoration ecologist. And people ask me all the time, what is a restoration ecologist? And I think in the simplest terms, my job is to identify, evaluate, prioritize restoration needs, and then develop plans and actually execute and oversee the restoration of rare species habitat and of important natural communities across the Commonwealth. And with that in mind, that actually makes a pretty nice segue into what we're talking about tonight, because these fire-influenced natural communities that's on the schedule is something that I think a lot about. And it's something that both the Heritage Program and the division really finds very important as part of its mission and put a lot of resources behind. And I think as we start talking through this, those reasons will become evident why we care so much about these communities. You know, just for real quick to start off, in a nutshell, they're globally rare communities, so that biological legacy is incredibly important and we're responsible for it. From a natural heritage perspective, they're real hotspots for rare and highly specialized biodiversity. And from the overall mission of Mass Wildlife, they're also incredibly important areas for the hunting and fishing community. And a lot of the work that we're doing here, restoring these communities, also bolsters a lot of our more vulnerable game species, such as American woodcock, ruffed grouse, etc. So if we're going to jump right into this, I think that the title that we gave this, Fire-Influenced Natural Communities and the Restoration, really is a good overview of how we're thinking about this. And what I'd like to do is sort of, for the first half of this presentation, break down this title so we're all kind of on the same page. And I'm probably spend about half of the presentation just kind of giving the background and setting up why these communities are so important, how they function, and their conservation value. So with that in mind, we'll start off with a definition. And let's define natural communities right up front, because I think, to me, when I look at conservation on a landscape scale, or really any scale, it's the lens of natural communities that I'm thinking about. And so the definition that I use when I think of natural communities is a predictable assemblage of species that express specific environmental conditions on the landscape through time. So that sounds kind of like a jumble of words, but if you break that down, it's actually pretty basic. It's, you know, and I work really well thinking with examples. So if we do a very broad example and just say the desert environment, if we think about that as a natural community. And so what are the environmental conditions driving that? Very poor soils, very hot, no water. What's being expressed by the biodiversity in those areas? You know, you think of cactus, you think of succulents, you think of the animal species being very highly specialized, right? So it's the expression of the species on that landscape dependent upon the environmental conditions. And so in New England, the main drivers of natural communities, those environmental conditions, are hydrology. They're often soil and bedrock mineral content, and their disturbance regimes and land use history. And we're going to talk about all of that and how all of that comes together. But I think it's really important to kind of think about this in terms of natural communities because, you know, from an agency perspective, that's the way we're looking at these landscapes. So when I'm tasked with thinking about a restoration plan for a specific species, I seldom think only of that species. I really look at the natural community with the idea that if I can get that natural community right, it will by default support that species and all the other species that should be co-occurring with it. It's just a much more holistic way of thinking about landscapes and landscape management. So natural communities. And then we'll go right into another definition and kind of start talking about barrens in general, because that's what we're really talking about here. So fire influenced communities in central Mass, this section really of the presentation really encompasses all of Massachusetts. But when we talk about fire influenced communities, the umbrella term that we'll often use is barrens. And that's a very general term, but what that term is describing are natural communities that are fire influenced and are very often in very xeric or dry conditions. So you think about those environmental factors, right? Very dry, fire, and then from here, we're going to talk about some very specific aspects and very specific community types that we're finding. But I think it's important, we're going to be shifting back and forth between fire influenced community and barrens. And, you know, for this presentation, they're essentially talking about the same thing. You'll hear the term barrens a lot when you start hearing and going to these places. It's really just setting up a fire influenced community in a very dry setting. And I think it's really critical to really understand the process of a barren, how it formed, how it functions, if we want to think about conserving barrens and their importance on the landscape. So I always like to begin these conversations by really setting the stage and talking about how these communities came to be, what's driving them, and how we expect that they'll move to the future. And I always like to start off with this photo, and it's really one of the favorite photos that I've ever taken, not necessarily for the aesthetics of it, but for what it represents. And being at the Alberta Nature Club, I think probably a lot of you are looking at this and either thinking, yeah, I know where that is, or that looks really familiar, where is that? So this was a photo taken in 2002 at Gate 37 in Quabbin, looking west. And if you look at the island to the left, that's Mount Zion, and look to the mountain to the right, that's Mount El, with a pass in between. And to me, what's so special about this photo is obviously it was taken during a severe drought year, or probably a series of years of drought. Reservoirs drawn way down, and what you're seeing is all the exposed sand and gravel outwash that was below the reservoir. And why this is so important to me is because if you kind of look at this with some imagination, it's almost looking at the Swift River Valley 10,000 years ago as the glacier was pulling away. So if you can picture 12, 13,000 years ago, during the end of the last ice age, as the glacier was pulling off, you know, a mile thick of ice, but warming up, breaking apart, within that ice is gigatons of sand and gravel that's been captured as that glacier has been moving over. And now that's melting, and all this water is rushing off of it, and all that water is just loaded with sand and gravel. And that's moving through all these river valleys. It's settling out into these big outwash plains and other geologic sand and gravel formations. And what you were left with at this time is this really, really harsh landscape. Roughly 10,000 years ago, all of that outwash, exposed sand and gravel everywhere. And if you look at that and you think, well, what kind of vegetation would establish on that? That's the beginning of the barrens legacy on the landscape in my mind, right? So if you look at this landscape and you think about that sand and gravel, you think about those environmental conditions, very nutrient poor, very dry, right? Sand and gravel. You picture trying to establish a lawn on this and you wouldn't be able to do that. And the other interesting aspect about this is because it's so dry, there's really no thermoregulation going on. There's no water there to regulate temperature. So it is acting much like a desert. It gets very hot during the day, but very, very cold at night. And you put all these conditions together and you realize it would take a very specialized suite of vegetation to establish here. These are species, and we'll kind of run through some of these adaptations, that would have established there at that time. And those are the species that would have persisted through time, right? Highly specialized and adapted to deal and actually thrive in these really harsh conditions. So highly specialized to withstand low nutrients, droughty soils, and extreme temperature fluctuations. That is sort of the base and the premise of what a barrens community is in Massachusetts, especially central Massachusetts, where you don't have things like salt spray and other disturbance factors setting back succession. It's really the harshness of that environment. And if we think about some of the individual strategies that these species exhibit that make them successful here, they're often deep-rooted. So if we look at a native warm season grass like little bluestem, its roots go down 15 feet. With the idea that it's going to be intersecting with as much water as possible in these very dry areas. Many of these species are nitrogen fixers. So if you think of them growing in these nutrient poor soils, they're actually pulling in nitrogen from the atmosphere and fixing it around themselves to actually build up the soil around them a little bit. Many have either leathery or waxy leaves to retain as much soil as possible. They can withstand growing season frost. And so that is actually a very underrated aspect of a barrens. And I can say that even this year, for as warm as it's been, we had killing frost in June in the barrens at Muddy Brook and in the barrens in the Ware River watershed. So this is something that, because of that extremely dry soil and the way the landscapes are configured, that's another aspect of disturbance that happens in these really harsh environments. And at Montague Plains, for example, that barren, they've recorded growing season frost in every month of the year. And one of my favorite strategies, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth as we get into this, is a long-term seed bank. But basically, in a nutshell, what that's saying is these are disturbance-dependent species that grow in very specific conditions. And absent of those conditions, they've evolved to essentially lay latently in the seed bank, waiting for those conditions to come back around, usually exposed mineral soil, some disturbance event. So to kind of wrap up, if we're thinking about where barrens are occurring, those edaphic features, those features concerning the soil are really the primary driver of barrens communities, right? It's that harshness. It's the idea that there's a suite of species that can tolerate and even thrive in those. And conversely, essentially all other species are not able to establish and thrive in these harsh conditions. So it really favors those specialists. And to talk about, just so we're kind of on the same page with what we're talking about in terms of species, I kind of have the 5 listed here to the left, and there's many, many more that are associates of barrens, but the real keystone indicator species are tree oak, scrub oak, low bush blueberry, little bluestem, which is a warm season grass, and pitch pine. And I have pitch pine hyphenated here because pitch pine is a very interesting aspect of the barrens to me. I hear the term pine barrens all the time. It's what I refer to as sort of the Montague Plains bias, right? So Montague Plains is one of our best known, longest established in terms of a management aspect, pine barrens in the interior of the state. And it's sort of anyone who's sort of come up and through, especially UMass or DFW, thinks about pine barrens in terms of the lens of Montague Plains. And we've imprinted on that. And when we see Montague Plains, we look around and we think that's what a barren looks like. And we kind of have this narrow focus. The reality is barrens come in all different kinds of configurations and sets of communities. And while pitch pine is a really important indicator of a barrens community, if you see pitch pine, you sort of have to stop and think twice, why is this here? I probably have something. The absence of pitch pine does not mean that you're not in a barrens community. So I think that's one misnomer that we sort of have to get past and sort of get over that Montague Plains bias. The pine plains at Montague are exceptional and they're fantastic, incredible resources, but they're not monolithic. There's a whole gradient and continuum of what a barren looks like in this state. And especially in central Mass, aside from Montague Plains, most of the riparian barrens, which is a relatively new aspect of these barrens that we're going to be talking about, do not look, superficially at least, like Montague Plains. And just one last footnote with this slide, that bottom header there, it's not just the presence of these species, but it's the presence as communities at scale. So it's not like if you see a blueberry, you're in a barrens. I mean, we can drive around almost any road in central Mass and see little bluestem because that's appropriate. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're in one of these communities. It's looking at the landscape and seeing these expressed on a landscape scale functioning as natural communities. And I think that's a really important aspect of how we think about identifying priorities across the state and how we actually select sites for management. And we're going to get into that more a little bit later. But just a very quick overview. So we talked about barrens sort of general, that umbrella term for fire influence community. I'd like to spend just a minute now going through some of the very specific types of natural communities associated with barrens that we're going to see in central Massachusetts and that we're actually dealing with, and from a management perspective. And we'll kind of walk this through from a successional context, thinking about some of the earliest successional and moving up towards some of the more forested areas. The first one is one of the rarest, and that's the sandplain grassland community. So we have plenty of grasslands in Massachusetts, but very few that actually look like this. Most of our grasslands we consider to be mesic, right? They're on good soils, they're hay fields. This is the opposite. So this is a photo that was taken at Francis Crane Wildlife Management Area in Falmouth. And I used it because I just love the photo so much. It's such a good representation, but we actually do have these communities in central Massachusetts as well. If you see on top, we have the status S1, critically imperiled. So the S stands for state, and 1 is a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being critically imperiled, 5 being secure. So this is the most vulnerable. It fits in the category of the most vulnerable natural communities in Massachusetts. And if we had a global rank next to this, and we'll talk about this in a bit, this would also be of global significance. These are ecologically incredibly important areas. If we think about sandplain grassland locally, they're mostly now relegated to airports because there's two things happening. Number one, these areas are really easy to develop. So many of them have already been lost to development. And number two, they're early successional stages, which means that without some kind of very regular disturbance, they very quickly go to shrubland and then the forest, and then that grass aspect is lost. So airports are being mowed annually. This is one of the best areas to still find sandplain grassland. And locally, Orange Airport is a fantastic example of the sandplain grassland community. And if you're a little bit more local and you're familiar with Lake Rohunta and Branch Bridge Road, it's small, but there is a gorgeous sandplain grassland at the old campsite on Branch Bridge that's just a couple acres, but those couple acres actually look like the foreground here. And, you know, these are dominated by little bluestem. They're on pure sand, so most of the biomass that you see here is actually 15 feet below the ground, not above the ground. A whole suite of rare plants associated with these areas, and this is really the signature natural community that supports species like upland sandpiper and grasshopper sparrow. Moving through the continuum a little bit, we get a little bit more woody, but not much different. It's the sandplain heathland community. This is also critically imperiled and globally significant community. And really the difference is it's subtle. Instead of being dominated by little bluestem, it's dominated by heath species. So predominantly low bush blueberry. What you're seeing in this photo is sheep laurel, but these heath species that grow in really dense clonal areas. Again, these are early successional, so they need pretty frequent disturbance events. Historically, that's been fire to keep them in this condition. And really the continuum between sandplain grassland and sandplain heathland is constantly fluctuating, right? If you were to look at this landscape 10 years from now, if it was being managed, and then 50 years from now, you would see that composition percentage fluctuate from grassland dominated to heathland dominated and back and forth. That's just kind of the nature of fire on the landscape. But when I think of these communities, I think of rare Lepidoptera, right? Moths and butterflies really keying in on the host plants associated with these communities. Then we have scrub oak shrubland, which is also, it's imperiled. And this is predominantly a coastal community, but we do find this inland. And it's, as the name implies, it's really dominated by scrub oak, which is a dwarf oak that really gets no taller than 6 or 7 feet. Of these barrens communities, Montague Plains has the best inland examples. Devon's in the impact zone, the Army base there has good examples that are several acres. Otherwise, you're gonna see these communities in central Massachusetts at 1 acre or less, sort of part of the continuum of the greater barrens community. But critically important, that scrub oak is a real host plant for a lot of rare Lepidoptera, and this is just ideal early successional bird habitat for species like prairie warbler and field sparrow and eastern towhee and on. Really special communities. And finally, pitch pine scrub oak woodlands. So when we think about, barrens in general, this is sort of the image that comes to most people's mind, and mine as well. And really, it's, as the name implies, again, it's pitch pine and tree oak in this kind of savanna-like setting with aggregations of scrub oak between. But again, if you picture fire moving through this, it's going to burn in different complexities each time it moves through, and the vegetation response is going to be different every time. So when we talk about barrens communities and these specific communities that we've kind of laid out here, they're really shifting over time and space as fire moves across the landscape over 50 to 100 years. So we use that catch-all, barrens, to kind of capture the greater mosaic of these sub-communities that's happening. And finally, I'm going to be pretty quick on oak woodlands, not because they're not important. They're actually probably account for the majority of our barrens community in central Massachusetts, but they're so varied and it's such a continuum that you'll notice that we don't even have a status rank on them because they're so variable. It goes from extremely rare oak hickory glades to just kind of general oak forest, but on some level, all to a degree fire influence. We'll kind of talk about why a little bit later. So I really don't want to undersell the importance of our oak woodlands in central Mass. It's critically important. Unfortunately, I'm probably already approaching time, so time is an issue, and just kind of keep this image in mind as we talk. And we're going to end up in this subsection on this photo, which is another one of my all-time favorite photos, and it also is from the Quabbin. This is actually from Quabbin Hill up by the tower. And I like this photograph so much because it takes all of the communities that we just talked about and puts them in one photograph that kind of shows that mosaic and that gradation between them all, right? In the forefront, you have a very small, but it's a nice representation of sandplain grassland. Just behind that, we have sandplain heathland. We have a nice scrub oak thicket beyond that, the woodlands, the pitch pine oak woodlands forming behind that. I can credit Dave Small for this, right? So Dave, you burnt this back in, I think in the early 2000s. That legacy still remains. And I kind of discovered this on my own and learned later that you kind of headed up the restoration up here. And what's really exciting is now we've re-engaged with the Quabbin and they're kind of picking up this legacy again. And this is kind of a high priority for them. And when we talk about communities shifting over time, just picture how a fire would move through here and how that complexity and how it would be really intense in some areas and lower intensity in the other areas. And how, you know, that sort of movement through time and space would create shifting vegetation structure and composition over time. So really, you know, there's nothing static about these barrens communities. They're constantly in motion, whether it's through succession or response to disturbance. And finally, just kind of talking about barrens, you know, we sort of set out how they function, how they came to be, what's driving them. Now we're talking about why do we care? And we kind of touched upon this already a little bit, but this map was a map that was put out, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. And it shows where the known barren sites were at that time. And what's so special to me about this map is from a conservation perspective, this is exactly why we care. This is why these are globally significant natural communities, because the map that you're looking at and those stars on the map are the world's occurrences of these natural communities. And so, you know, we have one enormous occurrence in New Jersey, the New Jersey Pine Barrens. That's 1 million acres, and that's obviously very significant. But your next largest is Miles Standish State Forest at 30,000 acres. Still very large, very significant, but when you're thinking in a global scale, pretty finite. And then moving over to Camp Edwards at about 20,000 acres, and that abuts Mass Wildlife's Francis Crane, which is sort of a joint collaborative restoration effort. We have Manuel Corella State Forest out on Martha's Vineyard. And then beyond that, it's essentially these interior, very small pocket occurrences. And places like Montague Plains and Albany Pine Bush, Ossipee Pine Barrens in New Hampshire represent the largest, but those are really ranging from 1,500 to 3,000 acres. So you start compiling and aggregate this, and even with New Jersey Pine Barrens 1 million acres thrown in there on a global perspective, pretty small and pretty significant biodiversity packed into this relatively small area. These areas were much more common in the past, and Long Island is a great example. So Long Island was once referred to as the Hempstead Plains. Now it's essentially a couple small reserves and tract housing. It's been estimated that 97% of Sand Plain grasslands have been lost to development. And you know, that's going to be a relatively recent event. So that kind of just shows you globally rare to begin with, and under these multiple threats of development and succession at the same time, really making a conservation priority for conservation agencies to protect this, because we're carrying a big responsibility because we're at the core of their range. But beyond just the natural community, it's the associated species that occur in these communities. So, you know, from a global level, we have this huge responsibility to manage and maintain these communities. But from a local level, we have, you know, we'll stay statewide, even regionally wide, Southern New England, I think of New York in that. We're really this core of some very, very highly specialized biodiversity. And if we think about the terrestrial components of the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, nearly 50% of the terrestrial species on that list are fire-influenced species associated with fire. And many of those are occurring in these barrens habitats. And that's just the listed species. We have other species, like we see a photo of prairie warbler, really closely tied into these barrens. Really highly specialized species, really dependent upon these specific communities, and without them, their populations would absolutely crash. So it's kind of like this two-pronged conservation focus. It's the community that's really important for the global perspective and the regional perspective, but also locally, this is where our rare and vulnerable biodiversity, these are real hotspots that really need our attention. And just to quickly run through this, and we'll kind of get into more detail when we do a site-specific case, but when I think of barrens, I think of rare Lepidoptera, right? Moths and butterflies. And the reason that these communities support so many rare Lepidoptera, it's really twofold. Number one, that's where the host plant for many of these species occurs. So when we think about why something is rare from a moth or a butterfly perspective, the limiting factor is often the host plant. And most of the species that are rare in barrens associates, their host plant, their larvae will only eat 1 or 2 species, and those species, plant species, occur just in these barrens habitats. So most of our rare Lepidoptera is feeding on lowbush blueberry or scrub oak. And so it's really interesting to think that those plant species on their own are not that uncommon in Massachusetts, but what is uncommon is them occurring in healthy populations on a landscape scale that can support these species. And that's the real difference between just looking at things from a species perspective and looking at things at a landscape perspective. And when you start looking at a landscape perspective, you start picking up these real specialists. The other prong of why they're rare is they have strategies to survive regular fire. So their host plant limits their distribution, but they also have this ability to survive what a lot of other species simply cannot survive. And so they've adapted to these communities, but they can only persist if these communities persist. A long list of plants that are also highly specialized to the barrens community. All 3 of these are actually in central Massachusetts. We have purple milkweed on the left, New England blazing star, which is a near New England endemic, in the middle, and then wild lupin on the left, which is not listed, but it may be soon because it's in such decline, because its habitat is in such decline. And of course, the associate vertebrates in these barrens habitats. So we mentioned grasshopper sparrow in the upper left is a real signature species of large sandplain grassland habitats. But then we also mentioned some of these early successional birds in the shrubbery areas like eastern towhee and prairie warbler, like down in the left. Box turtle usually occurs in low severity fire influenced landscapes. Hognose snake, a real signature of barrens communities, and we actually have a nice little population up in North Quabbin. And pine warbler, which is not that uncommon, but if you go into a pitch pine dominated landscape like Montague Plains, you're going to see a lot of pine warblers. So it's, really kind of focusing on the rare, but also thinking, well, how is this helping the more common species as well? And then just to expand that out, we find, from sort of a game perspective, when we go in and do restoration, which we'll be talking about very shortly, species like American woodcock just go through the roof, and rough grouse really respond, and wild turkey, and on and on. And finally, whippoorwill, which I'm going to just kind of skip over for right now, because A, I could talk for hours about whippoorwill, and B, I have slides later that will talk more about whippoorwill. But I'll just say for right now, the last 10 to 15 years or so, there's really becoming a growth in the understanding of this bird's relationship to fire. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth shortly. So kind of setting up the conservation value of barrens and how they function. The last aspect before we dive into management is sort of historic context. And sort of one disclaimer before we get into this section. It's a question I get all the time. And when we manage these communities, are we looking to bring them back to any certain time of history? And the answer is a clear no. Our interest in managing these fire-influenced communities is to, in the present, maximize their integrity as a community and to maximize the specialized biodiversity that they support. That's our primary goal. That said, understanding the context of these landscapes through history is incredibly important in understanding these landscapes and understanding how they interacted on the landscape and how the species associated with them have sort of moved in status through time. And so it's kind of this exercise, right? So this slide's titled First Contact of Forest Primeval, and it's a complicated answer. And I think one thing that we run into with some controversy here is a lot of people ask this question in a very binary way. It was either one or the other. It was either all old growth or there was just fires everywhere. And I think the answer really lies in between somewhere. right? We sort of had this myth of the squirrel that could run from Maine to Georgia through the canopy and the limbs of the old growth forest and never touch the ground. Was that the case? Kind of think probably not. It might have been situational. Certainly that occurred in vast acreages across Massachusetts and New England, but there were these other areas because there was people living here for thousands of years before European settlement occurred. And if you think about Native Americans, right, again, there's this sort of this myth of the shadow, you know, Native Americans living like shadows on the landscape, having no impact on the landscape. And if you think about Native culture, they were very complex societies that lived in villages, that practiced agriculture, that had been there for thousands of years. It's really hard to imagine that around their settlement areas, there wasn't some impact on the landscape. And we're going to go through the next few slides here and just kind of talk about that in a certain perspective. So I think that answer to the last slide, you know, what did it look like? I think we had a mosaic. I think most of Massachusetts probably was sort of climax type forest, but in these areas of habitation, which kind of happened to co-occur in these areas where of these glacial river valleys that we talked about where the barrens were establishing, you certainly had impact of the Native cultures on the landscape. And, you know, it's interesting. I think of Native culture in central Massachusetts as Nipmuc. That's the river people, right? So people living along the Quabog, the Swift, the Ware River. And that's where we're starting to see these landscapes pop up as well. So how do we think about this? Well, I mean, there's a few ways to kind of look back in time and try to piece together what the landscape looked like pre-settlement. One of my favorite entries here is History of North Brookfield, which was written in 1887. And, you know, it's certainly not contact, but it sort of references. And if you ever want to sit down with this book, there's some really fantastic accounts from settlement period observations. But just to kind of briefly touch upon this, and this is Brookfield. So this was associated with the Quabog River, with Foster Hill, you know, a real core area of Nipmuc population for context of what's being talked about here. And this first entry starts off, contrary to prevalent belief, the country at the time of settlement of Brookfield was practically bare of primeval forest. The annual burnings by the Indians destroyed the old growth and kept the uplands free of new growth of sprouts. And then my favorite part of this entry, because I know this area very well, from the top of Coy's Hill and other heights, cattle could be seen for a distance of 3 miles and deer and wild turkeys a mile away. All right, so this is describing a few things. It's an open landscape, it's describing annual burning, and when I read that last sentence of sort of looking across the landscape and seeing for a mile or more, that's describing these open woodland communities. And then the second one that I have, I'll just kind of jump to the bottom here, but I think this is kind of a really interesting aspect of the thought going behind some of the fire on the landscape. And I'll pick it up halfway through. It says, every such tribal possession contained 3 essentials of life: hunting grounds, fishing grounds, and arable land for cornfields. These, with oak, walnut, and chestnut groves, which were carefully protected from annual burnings, supplied natives with summer and winter food. So to me, this is just absolutely fascinating because it does reaffirm that idea of the annual burning, but what's more deep on this for me is that it's very thoughtful burning, right? It's not just burning the landscape broadcast and seeing what happens. They're actually excluding areas from the fire. They're actually thinking about goals and objectives. To me, that's prescribed fire. That's setting a fire with the intention of something specific to happen on the landscape. And you think of people doing this for a few thousand years over and over on these landscapes that are already sort of pre-set up like these really dry outwash areas, and you start adding regular fire to them, it just makes sense that you start getting these barren communities to express on those landscapes. And just kind of finish up this idea, talk about some of the other ways that we think about historical fire on the landscape. How do we sort of historically look back and think about fire? Well, we can look at soil profiles and see charcoal horizons in the soil where fires were occurring over time for long periods of time into history. There's the written accounts, so to the left, I mean, history of North Brookfield is just one very small entry in the canon of historical writings about this. It's all really fascinating. What we have here is Samuel Champlain's 1613 map of when he came upon Chatham. And if you were to read his journal, he's talking about Fort Hill and coming across this great grassy expanse with dotted red cedar. Well, that's a human anthropogenically influenced landscape that he's describing. That's a first contact open area. And even if you think about the Pilgrims and where they were settling in Plymouth, they didn't choose that area because it had the best, most fertile soil. They chose that area because it was already opened by people. So you had this history of this mosaic of these patches across the landscape. More scientifically, we have charcoal and pollen analysis, where you can actually go back and determine fire frequency and even severity over very long periods of time. And through pollen, you can reconstruct the natural communities of those time periods, and on and on. And if we think about native culture using fire and fire as a tool, I lost the reference, but there's a reference that talks about Northeast native use of fire, describing it as essentially a fire culture and listing 200 uses of fire in everyday life. And some of the main ones that's relevant to what we're talking about here is clearing land for agriculture, right? These same plains along the riparian areas, these were where corn was grown, cleared with fire, and it was rotational. They would grow there and then move on to the next and come back a few years later, reopen it with fire. Invigorating berry production, that's something that we do today in Maine and Western Mass, burning for berries. Pest management, we think about the tick situation today. I know when I'm out in a fire suppressed landscape, I'm seeing more ticks there in those places than anywhere else. Kind of makes you wonder what's going on, and is fire exclusion driving some of that? And finally, from a real mass wildlife perspective, creating habitat. Really a lot of the same principles that we're interested today were happening back then, whether it's for game species or berry production or on and on. And finally, before we get into the specifics of what we're doing on the landscape, I think it's really important that we talk about how fire functions in these communities on the landscape. So I think we can just kind of like briefly move through this and kind of talk about the sequence of fire over time on a landscape and what it does. So we're starting off in what I would consider to be a very high integrity fire influenced landscape, right? The photo that we see on the screen right now. This is Albany pine bush. If I were to look at this, I would say that this had burned in the last 1 or 2 years, had 1 or 2 growing seasons to recover. And it's this fantastic community. So if we set this as our anchor point, as sort of the objective that we're aspiring to, and then we'll sort of move through time as this moves forward. And so you take that original high integrity community, and as time goes by, and that time frequency is different for each community, but over time, fuel starts to build up in these communities. And that fuel is leaf litter. Every year the leaves fall off, branches fall off, builds up and accumulates. And so if you remember, we talked about one of the real drivers of these communities is the harshness of the soil. When you start adding all this organics to the soil, suddenly there's more nutrients, there's more water retention, your temperature fluctuations start to level out. It becomes much less harsh and much more conducive to supporting generalist species. So in this first stage, it's okay, it's still functioning pretty well, but you can kind of see the future as that organic layer starts building up below. We get into step 3, as more time goes by, more organics build up, and you start having this feedback loop start happening where the more organics start building up in the soil, the more generalists are able to take hold. The more generalists take hold, they start growing bigger, faster, more robust. They start putting down more organics in the soil. So if you look at this photo, this was taken at Gate 33 fishing area at Quabbin, which is a fantastic barrens. And you can still see that legacy there. You can see the pitch pine scattered throughout. You can see the open grown oaks, the heath in the bottom, but you also see this flush of white pine moving through. And perhaps even more importantly, you can see that blueberry starting to wane as that duff layer really starts to build up around it. And this is what we refer to as mesification. So mesic, essentially a term describing a moist condition. The longer this goes and mesifies, the more moist, the more organically rich it becomes, the less harsh, the more it starts supporting generalist species, and the faster you lose that barren's integrity. And so a community like this, which represents a lot of what we're seeing in the North Quabbin area right now, is really at a crossroad. And the next step could go in either direction. From my perspective, the great direction would be, this is the time that fire comes in and basically resets the community. So if you think about that last photo, you have all those generalists, you know, a nice fire moving through there is going to kill most of the generalists, and the specialists will survive. And the other thing that happens with a real effective fire moving through these areas is it's going to burn off a lot of that fuel on the ground. It's going to reset those ground conditions to a state where they become much more harsh, and it's very difficult for those generalists to reestablish again until that cycle starts building up again. The other thing that happens here is when you get a fire like this moving through and it burns off that duff layer and that organic layer, it re-exposes the mineral soil. And in that mineral soil is your specialized seed bank. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute in more detail, because I think it's really one of the best parts of this whole story. But right now you look at that landscape and it looks pretty barren, so to speak. Within a month or so, this is going to be flush and green, and those trees are going to resprout, but the ground cover is just going to come raging back, and not just with generalists, but with the species that are highly desired for this community. Now, the alternative to step 4, the alternative to fire, is if there is no disturbance event. And this photo here is showing a near fully mesified landscape, former barrens landscape. So you can see the legacy of the pitch pine there in the foreground, but if you look on the ground, you can just picture that duff is going to be 6, 7, 8 inches deep. You can see all the generalist vegetation around it. You know, it's coming in white pine and red maple. It's just no longer a barrens. We're going to talk in a bit just how amazingly resilient these communities are, and even in this condition, this can be restored. But in the moment, looking at this is not a functioning barren. And that's really showing how fire exclusion eventually leads to the loss of that resource. So from my perspective and looking at these, I've been with the agency for 20 years now, looking at all these communities, I've come to the conclusion that the #1 threat to our barrens communities in Massachusetts is actually fire exclusion. It's really interesting. If we look at where conservation has been happening, whether it's by default or focus, so much of our barrens or former barrens habitat actually has been protected. We think about the Quabbin, we think of all these Army Corps areas. They just inherently are overlapping in these river valleys because of the purpose that they function. So much of Mass Wildlife lands, and even DCR state forests, places like Birch Hill and Miles Standish, it was written that the state acquired them because they were barrens and considered worthless. So they were surplus land, these big blocks. So we've done pretty well in conserving the acres. What we really need to be thinking about now is actually conserving the biological legacy on those acres, right? It's this idea that you can protect the barrens, but if you don't manage them, you lose the resource that motivated you to protect them in the first place. And this slide basically just reiterates that. And before we're about to move into some of the specific management aspects, but I couldn't resist talking about whippoorwill real quickly, but I think it really kind of dovetails into that last thought about management and conservation. So, you know, I grew up in the 1980s, didn't hear a whippoorwill until I was in college. But my parents' generation and generations above them talked about whippoorwills essentially being nearly ubiquitous across the landscape. And the #1 question that I seem to get about whippoorwills or about just, you know, conservation in general for some reason, is older people asking, where have all the whippoorwill gone? And so in 2010, hearing this question so much, I decided to look into it. And what happened is really dug deep into the historical records. And it ended up being a listing proposal for the Heritage Program that resulted in whippoorwill being listed under the Endangered Species Act, because we were able to show such a strong retraction and decline in the overall whippoorwill population in the state. So the map that we're looking at right now is a compilation of that initial historical research, and basically looking at everything from Thoreau's journals to going through Bird Observer and records of New England birds all the way back to 1935, breeding bird atlases, anywhere we could find reliable data on whippoorwills and plotting them spatially across Massachusetts. And you can see pretty well over that time period, pretty well distributed, and sort of this gradient where the larger dots are showing larger populations or higher reported numbers. And this could be its presentation in its own, but I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase on this. This is our 2017 records, and this is showing us two things. Number one, incredible retraction and decline in population, which is very interesting. And when we plotted these original spatial records over time, I actually kind of looked at most of them, and most of them are either in outwash or in ridgetop or ridge slope oak systems, what you could infer to be as these fire influence systems. I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. But what was more compelling is looking at our modern data and seeing where these whippoorwills were still persisting as of 2017, and this is essentially, still a functioning map today. And the distribution in Massachusetts of the strongholds, or even where they're occurring at all, is really fascinating. So if you look at these red dots, most of them are aligning to places that we know, right? If you look at Martha's Vineyard, you have Corellis State Forest, a massive barrens that's still being managed actively. Miles Standish, same thing. Joint Base Cape Cod, same thing. Active fire management happening there. Montague Plains out in the valley, same thing. And then these little pockets in between, like in the Nashua River. One of them is Bolton Flats, Pine Hill, and Devons, which are being managed, or they're occurring in these areas that were either recently harvested or in and around sand pits. But the common denominator here is disturbance. And in the big strongholds like Miles Standish and Corellis and Montague Plains, it's active barrens, restoration, and management. And the other really interesting thing that came out is that Quabbin turns out to still be a real stronghold. So North Quabbin and then the Swift River Valley through Belchertown. And if you look at those areas, those are still showing a lot of that biological legacy. Last year, we went out and did a full moon survey on Quabbin on a night in May, and we had 28 singing birds on the islands alone. So really, really kind of impressive, and it kind of really shows you the opportunity that we have in the Central Mass area. And showing this map again, because for a different reason, talking about all these things. Well, no, actually, I sort of jumped the gun, I'm sorry. So I put this together yesterday, and I can't see what slide's coming next. So you're just as surprised as I am sometimes, but I know why I put this slide in here. And it's showing the correlation between the previous map and where the barrens are plotted on this map. So we have Montague Plains out in the valley and all of our coastal barrens. Look at this real quick, and I'm going to go back, and you can kind of see these correlations. So the point being, and this really brings it home, this next slide here, this is work done at Montague Plains by Micah Kresh from UMass when he was at UMass, essentially looking at land use of whippoorwills at the plains. And each one of these round dots represents a whippoorwill roosting spot, and each one of the triangles represents a nesting area. And if you notice, it's almost a one-to-one to where we've done management, we have whippoorwill presence. And if you look at that interior core, there's nothing in there. And it's such a strong take home to me. And sort of this affirmation of these other qualities that we were just discussing on the greater regional landscape level. So what do we do with all this information? Now we're going to kind of get into the management aspect. And actually, we're doing maybe okay on time. We'll see how this goes. So, we've sort of established that These are incredibly important conservation resources. They're very vulnerable resources for multiple reasons, but one of those reasons is that they're disturbance dependent, meaning that they need some sort of fairly regular management. So thinking about that, what's the next step in actual active conservation? And I think the number one thing that I keep telling people, and if, I give these presentations, and number one thing I can say as your first step is to make sure that you're working in an appropriate area, right? We talked about where historic fire was probably on the landscape and where it probably wasn't. We talked about the edaphic features that are driving these communities. The management that I'm about to talk about is not to occur just anywhere on the landscape. You really need to show that the edaphic features are correct, right? That sand and gravel or those poor, nutrient-poor soils, and then that biological legacy remains, right? So that sort of excises a big part of the state away from the coastal plain. What this map here is showing is some of our best opportunities in central Massachusetts for barrens management. And the exciting part is it's actually happening in some of these areas. In some areas, it's still conceptual. But what we did with this map is we looked at the Swift River watershed, the Ware River watershed, and the Upper Millers River. And we looked at, the first pass was superficial geology, looking at where the sand and gravel deposits were. And then we actually went out and we looked at most of these sites and looked for that biological legacy, and then we plotted it out. And what we came up with is these three really important core areas. One you can see all around the Quabbin. The southern point of the Quabbin there, that's Herm-Covey Wildlife Management Area in Belchertown. And as you come up to the east side, Pottapog Pond there, and that arm that comes down, that arm is Muddy Brook. And that's what we're gonna focus on very shortly. And then of course, North Quabbin. So Route 122 through New Salem. That's what I would consider one sort of mega site, thinking about opportunity. And then to the east there, we have the Ware River watershed, which is also managed by DCR. And a lot of that is also showing that really strong biological legacy on the proper edaphic features, really potentially very important barrens habitat. And then to the north, maybe closer to Athol Bird and Nature, we have the big block up there, which is Birch Hill Wildlife Management Area and Birch Hill Dam, the Army Corps area. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get deeper in. But those three areas are really, really important interior barrens legacy. And what the red is also showing is protected open space on state or federal land. So if you're from Athol and Orange and you're looking at the area around Rohunta and around the airport and you're thinking, why aren't the polygons there? We're really looking at government-owned land right now. In this first pass. But what's really incredible to me is if you look at the Swift River Valley and as it comes up and goes into Millers River, this sand deposit really goes all the way up into Keene, New Hampshire. And there's opportunities all the way through. It's really, really pretty special. Kind of goes back to that Montague Plains bias in a sense too. This is relatively new way of thinking. I think we've all driven through these areas so much and just saw the white pine stands and thought that's not a barren, what's going on? Because it doesn't look like Montague Plains. But now, and we're going to talk about this in the next slides, now that we're digging deeper and really thinking about this in a different way, we're seeing this legacy is in many of these river valleys in central Mass. And so let's dig into Muddy Brook Wildlife Management Area as a case study. And I want to talk about Muddy Brook for a couple of reasons. A, we consider this to be a riparian barren, which is very different than sort of that Montague Plains model that many of us are very familiar with. So Montague Plains is a much more pine-dominated system, and it's perched up on this glacial lake delta of just sand. There's really no wetlands up there. It's pretty uniform. What we're finding in these river valley systems is really kind of a whole new configuration of these barrens communities, right? It's this interaction between a real mosaic of different types of communities and community types. So for one thing, you have these kind of medium order brooks and rivers flowing through them. They're often going through these outwash plains, but they're often surrounded by cane terraces on both sides, which are big mantles of sand that go up these steep valleys. And then when you get above the valleys onto the bedrock, if you think about these areas and how they would have historically burned, that fire that was starting down in the sandy areas would have gone right up over the top. So what you have happening in these riparian barrens is this incredible mosaic and diversity of landscape happenings, all fire influenced, including the wetlands, coming together. So it's, you know, interior barrens, sort of in the conceptually similar to Montague Plains, but functionally on the landscape is giving you something very, very kind of different and much more diverse. So that's the number one reason I think the Muddy Brook model is much more applicable to what we're seeing in places like Birch Hill and North Quabbin. So I want to focus for that reason. And it's also the first riparian barren that we really focused on. So we've been looking at this one for about 15 years, doing active management for about 7. So we just have much more return. And I think it tells a really good story that can be extrapolated to some of these other landscapes in the North Quabbin area. So, you know, quickly, some background. I mentioned I worked for the agency for about 20 years. And, you know, the early part of that time, I was spending a lot of time in Montague Plains and down on Cape Cod, especially at Francis Crane Wildlife Management Area. You know, 2 classic, well-known barrens. And, you know, on one hand, sort of imprinting on that classic model, but on the other hand, kind of seeing these patterns happening on the landscape. And I live in Hardwick, which happens to be where Muddy Brook is. So I grew up on this landscape and I would visit it periodically. And so I started visiting it with this kind of new way of seeing the landscape that I was bringing from Montague and the Cape, and looking at this landscape and starting to think to myself, you know, I'm seeing some patterns here. This feels different, but it also has some commonality with these other barrens landscapes. You know, what's going on here? It's time to look a little bit closer. And even looking at this photo, I use this photo because this is how much of Muddy Brook looked 15 years ago, at least right around in sort of the core area. You know, semi-grown oak, well-spaced. You kind of had this, you know, heath layer, but it was also kind of getting this flush of white pine coming in, really dominant in some areas, really kind of nice in these in areas like in the photo. But looking at these landscapes in higher integrity areas, you started seeing these patterns and started thinking like, well, what is going on here? So you started digging a little bit deeper on the landscape, and you started seeing this legacy on the landscape. You know, this is kind of a retread of a photo that we looked at earlier, but this was really one of the first photos that I ever took at Muddy Brook, thinking about this and thinking about what was going on here. And this is that legacy pitch pine growing in the mesified forest. And, you know, as an ecologist, always sort of asking yourself this question of, why does the landscape look like this? How did it get here? And once you start thinking in those terms, you start piecing it together and the story starts to emerge. And walking around looking more, there was more obvious areas than that last photo. There was these remnant openings. So what we have here is a legitimate scrub oak thicket, just like we see at Montague Plains. And up against that, we have little blue stem growing in. And it's like, well, okay, there's another pattern here. We're starting to see this. This is making me slow down and think a little bit more, what is happening on this landscape? And then we're coming to this slide, which, you know, explicitly asks that question: why does a landscape look a certain way? You know, what is that landscape history? What are the adaptive features? What are the environmental conditions that are responsible for the expression of the vegetation on it? What is that land use history? Was there a fire history? And even in this photo, you know, again, we can see sort of these semi-open grown oaks. You can see fire scars there on the left. Something's happening here. And then looking at even closer, we can see this photo on the left is showing, we knew this was all sand and gravel, but actually seeing it on the surface layer like this, all of this growing on sand and gravel. This middle photo is one of those remnant legacy white pines, massive fire scar on it. And you start moving through this landscape, you start seeing fire scars on all age classes and sometimes multiple scars on trees. And you start thinking, okay, there's been a pattern here. And the photo on the right, it's something that we knew, but it's this affirmation, seeing it actually on the landscape, these really dramatic geologic features, glacial features. You know, this is an esker, but there's moraines and cane deltas and outwash from glacial ponds. It's like, okay, all of the elements are here, why? And I remember looking at this, 12 years ago with that Montague Plains bias, thinking this doesn't look like a barren, but man, there's something happening here. Let's think about this deeper. So I called in colleagues and we really kind of dug in and took a closer look at this. And someone who will remain unnamed, but I remember before getting out there, them saying to me, yeah, I don't know, there's no barrens in Hardwick. And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders and I thought, yep, there's the Montague Plains bias. And once we got on the landscape, we started seeing, collectively looking at this and talking this through and our shared experiences. And it's like, yeah, this does not look right now. It's not presenting and expressing like a Montague Plains, which is high integrity. But man, we can see where this came from. We can see where this was. Maybe we should dig in here a little bit and try to figure this out. And maybe there's a management opportunity here. So we went from the present, looking at the landscape level and getting all these clues and thinking, this is pretty interesting, what's happening here. And right around the time we started thinking, maybe we should be developing a management plan and doing some small scale work here, I received this aerial photo from our land agent for the Central District, and with a note saying, yeah, I found this 1938 photo of Montague Plains, would you be interested in this? And I opened it up and I essentially fell out of my seat. I mean, if you looked at a lot of aerial photos of what a really high integrity barrens looks like, this is it, right? I mean, looking at this is the core of Patrol Hollow, of Muddy Brook, the Patrol Hollow section as we refer to it. And you can see, okay, it's wide open. That's interesting, but not that compelling. Most of Massachusetts was open agricultural land at some point. But the signature on this is not typical agriculture. For one thing, you can see these north-south roads running through there. Those are sand roads. That's really interesting. And then these areas in the interior here, that texture, that's not showing just typical regeneration of shrubs. I mean, that really looks heathy to me. It looks like low bush blueberry with these aggregations of shrubs. And you can see the individual trees rising above it by their shadows. And there's not many in there, but they're in there. And then when we go on the landscape to look at that, they're either these enormous legacy white pine or they're pitch pine. And, the pitch pine that remained that are showing up in this photo, open grown, but limbless, up 30 feet, really suggesting, well, there's a fire history here. And then, of course, on top of that, looking at the actual topography of this and seeing, especially on that east side of the brook, up on that big cane delta there, that big flat plain, seeing all these kettles, those are frost pockets. And we've been in those and they're functioning that way. And it's like, okay, this is really compelling, right? This isn't the reason to do management here, but this is one more just really important cue in thinking about this landscape and understanding this landscape and gaining that historical context to kind of influence where you might take something in the future. That was a very exciting day. And then we dug a little bit more and we started finding these historic photos. And again, this photo I find interesting. It's not necessarily that compelling on its own. This is the south part of the wildlife management area. In I think 1910 or 11, this was a US Geological Survey photo. It's showing the north end of Hardwick Pond. It's all open. That's not that compelling. It's, not unusual for the area, but then you start looking, you see that downed wood and you see the fire scars and it's like, okay, well, fire. This is a burned landscape. And again, that alone isn't reason to do something, but it's just one more part of the story that's kind of reaffirming something very interesting was happening here. And then I'm certainly not going to read all this, but I'll summarize it, which is 2 excerpts from the most recent copy of History of Hardwick. So there was 2 editions, and there was one that was written, I think in the 90s by Emily Bancroft, that was an update to the original. And it had these really nice entries. The top one is talking about the Muddy Brook Valley and how it was not used for agriculture. It had always been essentially forest land. It was woodlands, and there was 3 families and they ran sawmills. But what was so interesting to me is the way that the actual forestry practice were described here. And it was describing sort of this clearing off the land in the 1800s. And sort of the practice of the day apparently was not selective harvesting, but just sort of this kind of whole scale removal. And then you picture this happening on a few rotations, and you can kind of see how things would start kind of, if this had been barrens originally, and then that practice was applied to it, it's just very interesting to think about that level of disturbance happening on a landscape like this. But I think even more important is the second paragraph. And again, it's sort of a short lens of history, but I think it's an important lens of history because it's what we have. And this is describing the fire history. And basically from the early 1900s until 1942, it describes this series of really intense wildfires that happened in the valley. Some of them enormous that jumped the hill and went into the quad and burnt square miles at a time, but happening at really high frequencies. Just see this real quick. I mean, there were 7 major fires recorded between 1902 and 1942, and 4 measured in terms of square miles and encompassed the entire valley, with smaller fires happening interstitially in time. So just during that time period, a really heavy fire presence here. And like I say, I grew up in Hardwick. My uncle owned one of the larger farms, and I talked to him about this before he died. He said, "Oh yeah, no, I remember the 42 fire. We would go in, we fought it for a week. We would fight the fire for most of the morning, and then we'd go milk the cows and come back and fight the fire again." And around this time too, around the wartime, there was conscientious objectors living in Petersham who came down and helped on these big fires. So, some cultural history in there as well. This was interesting to me, again, sort of, building this portfolio, thinking about this landscape over time, thinking about interior barrens, in my mind, going back to that comment, there's no barrens in Hardwick. This is a 1935 publication of, as it says, forest types of southern New England. And that hatch that you see around Springfield, that comes up through Ware, Palmer, and into Hardwick, that's pitch pine plains. So this was actually documented in the 30s as a pine barren, Muddy Brook as a pine barren, and we didn't find this until after. So it's kind of these pieces, we made this observation, we started following it up, and the more that we researched, the more these different seemingly disparate pieces of information started to come in and collect and build out this kind of short-term story. Admittedly, this is mostly, 20th century information. However, it really inspired us to take a deeper look at this and thinking about historical context. So we actually hired, that's Dana McDonald on the right, who works for the Woods Hole Institute and for UMass. And on the left is Jonathan Perry of the Wampanoag tribe. And they came out, Dana led this project of doing charcoal coring and pollen analysis in one of these ponds in Muddy Brook. So basically the idea is digging down, you can get down to the bottom layer of these ponds, and it's essentially this time capsule since the retreat of the glacier. Pre-glacier, everything was scoured off the earth, but post, every year as sediment and things, charcoal and pollen start to accumulate on the bottom, you can bore down through this, reconstruct this, and what you're basically able to do is reconstruct fire history, and also through the pollen, actually identifying the pollen grains to species, reconstructing the natural communities that occurred through time on this landscape. And so this was the preliminary chart that came out of this work, and this sort of kind of set us all back on our heels. And I know there's not a lot of time to digest this. It might just look like squiggly lines if you're looking at this for the first time on the computer. But essentially, this orange line is showing charcoal pieces through time. And what it's really showing is these really high peaks that go back to 10,000 years. So a really long fire history. And if we go back about, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, really, a lot of charcoal in the landscape, indicating a lot of fire on the landscape, which I find interesting. But what was really compelling to me was the pollen aspect. And if you look down, and this is difficult, on the screen like this, one more reason I wish I was in person here, but if you look down on the bottom line here below on the left, you see oak-dominated grass, 2 to 7%, oak-dominated grass, 7%. That's reflecting what came out of the pollen analysis. And I'm sorry, I'm home and I'm getting a little distracted, right? Something outside, but let me just collect my thoughts here for a minute. So basically what this is doing is going back through time and reconstructing those natural communities. And especially this period from about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, you know, oak dominated woodland community with a grass graminoid presence of 12%. And, you know, so that was described to me as outrageously high, and really one of the highest grass signatures recorded in the Northeast, including, you know, comparable to some of the known native occupied areas on the outer Cape. So basically what this is describing is an oak dominated woodland with a graminoid base that was seeing a lot of fire at the time. So you put all these things together and it's like, you know, as I mentioned before, we're not trying to go back in time. We're not trying to recreate anything necessarily. We're trying to enhance the existing biodiversity that we have in the present. But this really is incredibly informative to think about these landscapes over time and just really get that context and understand. And this study was really, really important for us to really kind of dig into these areas, especially areas that weren't recognized as barrens so long ago, just because they didn't look like what we expected. And they had sort of succeeded beyond that area of integrity that we would even recognize them as barrens. But as we started digging in and finding all these cues, and then we put it against this, it was just this really wonderful affirmation. Like, yeah, what we were seeing is actually real, and what we're seeing at other sites we can take and we can apply to the observations that we're making here in real time. And this was just a really amazing way of tying all of these things together. So what do we do with all this information? Well, from a conservation point of view, we apply it to management, and that's what we're going to get into with this part of the this part right now. And we're going to talk about management at Muddy Brook, what we've been seeing, and really what that means for some of these other areas in the North Quabbin area. So, right, we've established that these communities are very important. They have this incredible biological legacy, that they're disturbance dependent, that they're a real priority for our agency and for other conservation agencies. Now it's actually time to do something on the ground, and that means management. And so we talked about how over time these communities sort of build up, generalists come in, they lose their integrity. This is what a lot of Muddy Brook looked like prior to our first restoration action. And so, you know, it's a fire influence system, but if you were just to try to set this on fire, it really wouldn't do anything for you, right? The generalists are so well established that you're not going to get the results you want. You're really, when you think about barrens, if you think about those early slides in the presentation, we're looking at two things. We're looking at species composition and we're looking at structure. So the structure is generally open and the composition is dominated by specialists. You're kind of on the other end of the spectrum here. You have this really closed system and you're dominated by generalists. What you really need to do is to reset the system, and fire will not do that. It needs to be a mechanical operation, which in a case like this ends up being a harvest. And so these are the restoration tools that we use for a first entry barrens restoration. And it's basically a forestry operation. And what our goals on an operation like this are to go into a site to remove the generalists. So if you see that upper left photo, that's a harvester removing the white pine. We gotta get that out of there. And the upper left, the upper right is skidding that out. And there's a very specific reason for what we're doing this. I mean, we do whole tree harvesting because we actually want that material off the site. If you remember what's really driving these barrens communities, it's the harshness of the site, right? And as more organics build up in the soil, the more conducive it comes to generalists and the more that it suppresses the specialists that we really want. So we're actually, by skidding whole tree operations like this, we're gaining two things. Number one, we're getting the organic material out of the site and resetting it. And number two, the scarification that results from doing this breaks up that duff layer and exposes that latent legacy seed bed. And that's where your biological legacy is actually hanging out. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. So first entry, it's a harvest, essentially resetting the landscape. This is what that often looks like in an area that's in decent shape, right? So this is an area that doesn't have a lot of white pine in it. It's mostly oak, and it's, you know, a really kind of nice feature here. It's a scarlet oak, black oak community, which is a priority natural community. It's an S3, it's somewhat rare. So we're going in here and we're basically just thinning it, and we're trying to expose some of that mineral soil on the ground to get sunlight, to engage the seed bank, and to prepare it for prescribed fire. On the other hand, in some of these areas where it's dominated by white pine, the operation looks much different. Essentially, we try to retain as much quality oak and pitch pine as possible, but in some of these areas, like you see in front of us, there's just nothing to retain. So this was probably a small field associated with a homestead, came back to old field white pine. You know, this was closed canopy, very little on the ground cover. So this first entry is a pretty dramatic impact on it. We're essentially removing all the trees, not because we want all the trees gone, but because there's really not the oak or the pitch pine to retain in these areas. And we're going to go through a series of photos of what happens in these areas, because it's pretty remarkable when we see these areas recovering. So we talked about soil scarification and why it's so important. This photo is kind of nice. We talked to a lot of foresters, and they're frustrated because they're not getting oak regeneration. The majority of the green leaves that you see here is oak seedlings on scarified soil immediately following one of our operations. And again, it's this idea of mineral contact with the seed, in this case, the acorn. If you can get that acorn exposed to sunlight, exposed to mineral soil and not duff, you get an incredible response like this. And now we're 5 years post-harvest, and most of these seedlings have made it, and they're our next generation coming up into the woodland. But I like this photo even better. Even though it's not an attractive photo, this is really kind of bringing home the idea of why we think scarification is such an important part of the process. If you look at the left, that's an area that looked almost exactly the way it looked pre-harvest. And there was no soil disturbance. And you see there's, you know, a couple sprigs of sheep laurel, and that is it growing there. That duff is so pervasive and so thick, there's nothing growing on it. But if you look to the right, where the scare brought it down, you know, just took that top duff layer off, exposed the mineral soil, that is 1 year's growth, all volunteer from the seed bank. And that seed, you know, this was an area that has been closed canopy forest for 60 to 70 years. So that seed has been sitting there for decades, just waiting for the right disturbance to come along, which in this case, it was the removal of that duff layer, exposure to mineral soil and sunlight, and we had this amazing flush of sedges and other barrens obligates coming in. So this is a real motivation, along from just getting the organics off the site for the harshness, it's also breaking up that duff layer to re-engage that legacy seed bank below. This is what a lot of the areas look like a year after, especially when there's oak to retain. This kind of open woodland area, you can see, you know, coming in, this was all bare, and we'll see some photos of that soon, but coming in all natural volunteers from the seed bank coming through. And once we get to that point, that forestry operation is a one-time entry, and then we move into a more maintenance mode, which is putting prescribed fire on the landscape. So essentially what we've done is reset the structure and composition of that landscape through the forestry action, kind of got it all set up, and now we've let the seed bank take over, and now it's just sort of bringing back that historic fire regime to the landscape. And that's where we are in a lot of these areas now at Muddy Brook. They're either have seen fire, or they're about to see fire because the initial forestry operation has been completed. And this is one of the early areas that we burned in Muddy Brook, where what you're seeing here is just this incredible flush of low bush blueberry. This is actually a spring fire, and this photo was taken that fall of the same growing season. So again, you know, a lot of these areas were closed canopy with very little ground cover. We come through, we scarify it, then we burn it. and we get this amazing flush of the obligates that we're looking for. And you know, blueberry are incredibly important component of this, and we're going to talk about that very shortly when we talk about some of the rare species associated with these sites. But again, just another nice photo of 1 year after the initial operation of how it responds. This is 2 growing seasons, so you can kind of see in that second season, you start getting a little bit more structural diversity happening. You can see in the foreground here, you have the heath, you have the graminoids, but then you also see these clusters of scrub oak through here. And this is an area that probably, you know, looking at this photo, we would probably want to enter this in about 2 years for the first fire. And in a community like this, we would probably look to burn this on a rotation of every 5 to 8 years, roughly. So it's going to more or less kind of look like this in that mosaic pattern that we talked about earlier. And just, you know, we're kind of coming to the end here, but I just really like this sequence of photos because this brings the whole process home to me. So we did photo plots beginning before the restoration, so we could kind of plot what things looked like. And again, that phrase comes to my mind, there's no barrens in Hardwick. And I look at a photo like this and I shrug my shoulders and say, yeah, of course not. This doesn't look anything like what we would expect. If you've been to Muddy Brook, this is taken in the western landing off of Patrol Hollow Road, sort of the main area where everyone goes, obviously pre-harvest, but it gives you a really good idea of what some of this landscape looked like, right? Closed canopy white pine and ground cover of kind of just fern and rubus, and just kind of, it feels Masic. You know, I see birch in there and red maple, pretty uninteresting. You know, this was an area that we were relatively new to this. We were actually not going to harvest this because it looked so different than the other oak areas that we thought, yeah, this may not even be part of it. We know that it's on sand, but is this really going to respond in the way that we would hope it would? Well, we went for it, and this was during the operation, and looks pretty awful there, right? It's doesn't look like a barren at that point, but then we gave it 2 years. This is the same location. And this is kind of exactly what we've been talking about, right? You remove that canopy of generalists, you scarify the soil, you get to the sand beneath, you get to that seed bank beneath, and all of a sudden you're looking at an almost instant barren. And, you know, so we go to this photo, and, you know, the oak areas, I had full confidence, and that just made perfect sense to me. But when I saw this happening and I saw that it looked like this before, it's like, where is this going to go? And then it didn't naturally reseed for a couple months. I thought, oh man, what's going to happen here? And then this happened, and it was like, wow, this is actually, you know, what's so fascinating to me about this photo here is these areas were the worst. There was a couple of these areas that were just white pine monocultures that we were, you know, even questioning whether we should touch them. That seed bank was there so strong that it came back that they turned out to be some of the nicest areas on the whole property. And so my number one takeaway from these communities is that they are incredibly resilient. Especially you see that last 3 sequence of the before, during, and after, and see what that turned into from where it started when we started. And it just says, you know, these communities have been here for so long, but not just that, they've been here ebbing and flowing and sort of cycling in and out with the disturbance that has happened around them, and with their strategies of essentially going dormant during bad times and then flushing back onto the landscape in great numbers when the right disturbance happens. And we'll kind of get through, finish up here with some of the success stories of the species that happened on this landscape. But this is my number one takeaway, is just the absolute resilience of these landscapes and how we really need to be thinking of them, not in terms of the now, but as thinking of them as through time, right? Where have they been? Where are they now? Where could they go? And if you think about it in that terms, and coupling that with the idea of just the life histories that are built for resilience, it really kind of gives you a lot of hope that, man, we can really bring these places back. And Muddy Brook is showing this, and that's what we're going to get into now, and that's what we're going to finish up on. So, you know, we really looked at a few different tiers of biological metric to kind of measure the progress here. Obviously, plants was one of them. And, you know, you saw some of those before photos. They were really uninteresting looking places with almost no ground cover. And when we think about barrens, it's really all about the ground cover, right? It's the lowbush blueberry, it's the scrub oak, it's all these barrens obligans. And it was a pretty poor list. I mean, there was things there that cued us in, like scrub oak, that we should be there and in enough numbers, but these sort of complementary species were either absent or in incredibly low numbers. And this stat right here just kind of amazes me. So I'll just read it, but we had 25 plus barrens obligate plant species that were not detected prior to the restoration work that had emerged from the seed bank, including 2 endangered species, 2 threatened, and several watch list species. And it just kind of goes back to this idea, right? So all these barren obligates were there. We couldn't see them because they were seeds buried under the duff layer. But as soon as we reset that landscape, they surged everywhere. So this photo is showing thick-nosed geranium, which is a watch-listed barrens obligate with pink corydalis behind it, and all this different sedges and graminoids around it. This was an area, this is one of those pine areas that was just so ordinary and basic and, you know, common that we almost didn't include it in the unit. We're getting some of our best response in these units. Other species that were present but incredibly low numbers. So this is New Jersey tea. This is one of the real signature species of the barrens community. I counted 5 really thorough surveys. We had 5 plants spread across 700 acres. This is just one little area. We did not seed any of this. There's over 1,000 plants on just this one little hillock right here, sitting there again for 50, 60, 70 years, just waiting for that scarification and just exploding. And so, you know, you can see it's in bloom here, incredible pollinator habitat, but what's even more interesting, it's the host plant from the New Jersey tea inchworm, which occurs in this valley, one of, I think, 4 places in all of Massachusetts where it occurs, was not occurring on the WMA because there wasn't enough host plant. Well, now we have enough host plant, and that's changed. And even the pitch pine, you know, I almost get a chill when I think about this. This is the best grove of pitch pine that we have. And this was in that before photo. So this was all encased with closed canopy white pine. There was no regeneration happening. And when I was standing here one day, actually giving a presentation on the site, looking at this, and it hit me that if we didn't open this up at the time, this would have been very most likely the last generation of pitch pine in this valley. Because it would have just senesced under that canopy and died. It doesn't seed bank well, and that would have been the end. But if you were to go up on this hill now, and I encourage you to do it, there's pitch pine regeneration everywhere through this. So it's just kind of, again, that idea, these long-lived species just kind of hanging out in the background during the bad times, waiting for the good times. If we waited longer to do this, we might have lost it, but we caught it in time. And now rare species reestablishment, we're sort of bolstering some of this. On the left, where there's a nearby local population of Liatris, New England blazing star, that we've collected seed. There's a historic record from Hardwick. We don't know it was from Patrol Hollow, but really good indication, and this is a nearby source, so we're reestablishing that back on the landscape. And on the right is lupin. We knew that was on the landscape in the 1980s. That has not come back through the seed bank, but we found a source just 2 miles downstream. Now there's thousands of plants back on the landscape. Bees. So to me, this is one of the most compelling stories of what happened at Muddy Brook. Before we did restoration, we collaborated with Joan Milam from UMass, who came out and really thoroughly surveyed the site for bees, and she came up with 35 species of bee pre-restoration, sort of in that closed canopy condition that we saw the photos of. 2 years later, post-restoration, she found 140 species. And we're still finding new species popping up. And some of these are barrens, well, many of them are barrens obligans, but some of them are actually very rare, incredibly host specific. And it just makes you wonder, where were they during these times when they weren't expressing? Were they just hanging out on that landscape in very low numbers, or did they come in from elsewhere? It's an amazing question to me, but considering that there's 400 species, known from the state, we have 140 occurring just at Muddy Brook after just 2 years post-restoration, up from just 35 species, is kind of mind-boggling to me, and really just another affirmation of how resilient these communities are and how important they are. And finally, Lepidoptera. So to me, this is the real signature of the barrens community in terms of thinking about it, because the barrens obligants of Lepidoptera are so host specific that they just cannot occur outside of them. So if you have them, you know your host plant communities are in really good shape. And currently we have 6 state listed species recorded in the valley since 2015. For the WMA, our first harvest was in 2015, and we didn't start getting the state listed species until 2 years later. Most of those came from a friend of mine, Brian Clasanos, who lives just south of the WMA. He manages his land in a similar way. He has most of the full suite on his property, and now we're seeing they're starting to turn up on our property. And just real briefly, we'll go through some of these, but Zanglinantha Martha, the pine barrens, Zanglinantha, which is a pitch pine obligate. We have that really nice stand of pitch pine there. We had it south on Brian's property. I surveyed it here 6 years consecutively, did not get it. I finally got it this year and had 5 individuals, which tells me that, again, like the bees, just kind of probably hanging in the background, barely hanging on below detectable levels. But as we start getting that regeneration, the species responds to the host plant. Hemeris gracilis, one of my absolute favorite leps, a low bush blueberry feeder. So we had our first show up on the property in 2016. We hold a CR in the north part of the property with New England Forestry Foundation, and they did a cut under our specs over the winter. I caught 6 of these in 1 day on that property, which I still really, it's just amazing to me. A good day in good habitat, you'll catch 1 or 2. So 1 year post restoration, to get 6 of these in one area is just remarkable. Mentioned the New Jersey tea inchworm, incredibly rare moth. As the name implies, sole host plant is New Jersey tea, one of just a handful of sites in the state. Again, just barely hanging on at trace levels, and now really starting to come back in full force in the valley. This is a wetland species. This is the pitcher plant borer moth, but I include it here because A, it's one of my absolute favorite moths, but B, it sort of shows the diversity of the riparian barrens community. So we think of barrens as terrestrial communities, but there's all these fire-influenced wetlands and boggy areas and seeps and fens all through this pockmark, this landscape. You know, all these kettles are intersecting with the groundwater and are mineral influenced in different ways. And it could be a presentation on its own, but I throw this one in here because it's one, again, just a handful of sites in the state where this occurs. But the bog species associated with this barrens are pretty remarkable. Finally, birds. We did several pre-restoration point count rounds and then post, and you see some of the biggest gains here from eastern towhee. Prairie warbler, which was not even on the property in 2015, is now one of the most abundant. We're getting more than 1 per point count effort here. Just really remarkable. They just flooded the site almost immediately. We now have brown thrasher. It's not showing up on this because this was a few years ago, but now field sparrow is kind of off the chart. Whippoorwill had been absent from the property for 30 years. We know that because we had someone living, one of the abutters there would always, you know, talk about the whippoorwill that he would hear there. He called me up 2 years after the harvest, all excited, they're back. Last year I surveyed it, we're up to 5 pairs calling on this site now after a 30-year absence. There's whippoorwill. And just finally, one of the really interesting components of this is the effect that this management has had on the closed canopy species. And this could be another just topic on its own, but I'm just going to briefly touch upon it, right? So we think about species like scarlet tanager and eastern wood pewee as these kind of closed canopy species. And what we find is their numbers have really stayed the same post-harvesting here. You know, in the woodlands, and you can kind of see what the woodlands looking back here, they're still there in the same numbers. They're still using this habitat. But what's really interesting is our state ornithologist, Bruce Vitz, set up a avian productivity monitoring station in here, basically a banding station to look at post-fledgling dispersal. And what he found, this is one of those classic frost pocket scrub oak thickets here. He had a mist net sit in there, and really one of the most productive sites in the constellation of monitoring sites across the state for interior nesting birds was here. And what we're finding is even the interior nesting birds post-fledgling are going to these early successional habitats, so they may be nesting in the closed canopy areas, but they're relying on these closed canopy areas. And again, I mentioned woodcock. If you were to walk through here on an April evening, you literally cannot count the woodcock because there's too many in the air at the same time. It's really one of the most spectacular sights you'll ever see. And so we're just kind of wrapping up now. We talked about Muddy Brook and talked about some of these other opportunities, going back to this map, thinking about Birch Hill, for instance, and North Quabbin. Birch Hill, we actually have work underway there. This is a before after. We're a before photo up on New Boston Road across from the Rod and Gun Club. This we identified as prime heathland community. You can see the legacy. It's not even that much of a stretch to see this one. This is what it looked like during the operation, which is pretty brutal. And people see this and like, oh man, what are you guys doing? This is the first growing season. So this is what that blueberry did once we removed that generalist white pine and brought it down. We haven't burned this. We're not going to burn this for another year or two. It doesn't need it. But this is that S1 globally significant state critically imperiled community almost instantly reemerging on the landscape. And we're working with Antioch University right now. They're doing targeted rare Lepidoptera surveys on a lot of these active barren sites. They found Hemaris gracilis here, and they found the pink sallow, the carnosa, blueberry feeders, both of them on this. So already within just a year and a half of the initial work, we're starting to get this response at Birch Hill. And then if we just drop down a little bit to the Army Corps area, again, talking about the Sand Plain Heathland community, this is Expand. So this, if you're familiar with it, this is the rifle range. And DFW has been working very closely with Army Corps to manage this area to kind of optimal community specs. So we have this beautiful, critically imperiled community here, functioning really well. Antioch is surveying here and also finding the same suite. But then, stepping back a little bit further out at Birch Hill, we find these woodland opportunities and are just vast. And so between our wildlife management area, where DFW is doing work, we're also collaborating with the Army Corps on some really targeted areas of real barrens restoration. This is a spot on Elm Street that has been marked, a prescription has been made, and it's sort of that Muddy Brook model of how this may be managed in the future, and we're just essentially working out the details and waiting for a go on this to bring this legacy back to Birch Hill. So North Quabbin, again, sort of in the Athalberta Nature Club realm. North Quabbin, Blackington, and Lake Rahunta to me are just as good as it gets. Just really, really amazing opportunities all through there. And if you think about Lake Rahunta, Orange Airport, and then if you look at the Sand Islands all through North Quabbin, it just makes perfect sense. This is an area off our Route 122. We refer to it as the Blackington entry. This is the first entry here. This was cut, I think, 2 years ago, and you can already see this amazing heathland coming in, graminoids filling in between, pitch pine being retained there. And to the left, what you can see has not been harvested yet, but this is very thin with pitch pine. There wasn't much to retain, but the pitch pine density to the right here is really incredible. So hopefully this will be a phased operation. And then gate 33, this is the access road peeling off right before you get to the fishing area. Just another spectacular barrens area. Bassett Island, you can look across the reservoir. I don't know if we'll ever be able to do anything out there because of access. It's an island, but you can just see the pitch pine, and I surveyed this, and it's all heath and open grown oak, just on and on. So, this is the base of North Quabbin, kind of bringing it back, kind of telling us why this area looks the way that it does, and why we're discovering what we're discovering there. So just finish up with this slide right here, sort of tongue in cheek a little bit, but not really. You know, this was made 15 years ago, and I think we had the Montague Plains bias in mind. We see a big gap there in central Massachusetts. I think it's time we maybe put some stars on that map, because our understanding of these communities has really changed over the last decade. And with that, I'm sorry I've gone probably way over, but if anyone's still out there listening, I'm here for questions.
All right. Good. Thank you, Chris. That was great. I know we are a little long. We still have quite a cadre of folks, so I'm just seeing, I guess we're there. So anyway, a couple quick questions. You know, Brian Hall was asking about the frequency of return on the fire, and what is it based on? Is it the structure, or what empirical evidence do you use to figure out when to go back in?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a prime question. So we look at a few different aspects of that. Structure is definitely part of that, and it's really kind of our goals, if it's, you know, grassland or heathland or shrubland. Also, composition is a real driver of this. So, you know, if we're happy with the structure, we're really not going to re-enter it until we start seeing generalists come in. And then at that point, the fire would be to remove those generalist species. So, you know, if it's a shrubby community, we would expect that a typical fire rotation would be 5 to 10 years.
All right. And yeah, Tom Rowinski was wondering, does jack pine occurring in Munson on the 2-mile section of Route 32? Is that a native there? Is that something that was transplanted?
I think I'll defer to Tom on that one. I've heard about that occurrence, and I'm fascinated by it. I haven't been there yet, but Tom, I've heard that. I think you're the one who maybe found it. So if you have thoughts on that, I'd be very interested in that. That would be a big find if that was native.
Yeah. All right. So does anybody else have a question? Again, this will be, this has been recorded. It'll be available on the Athol Bird Nature Club website. If I do my magic, I'll be able to put this on YouTube, and it'll be in your email that you'll receive in a day or two from after the webinar. Everybody that signed up, and even the people that signed up and didn't attend, will receive an email with some information and a link to the video. So with that, do I see any other? Oh, okay, here we go. Ron Amadon. As I've seen studies that state burns repeated every 5 to 7 years will dramatically help to reduce ticks. Any truth in that?
I think the jury's a little out, but it's we're actually looking at maybe collaborating and doing some research with universities ourselves on that. I think it's a very hard thing to study just because of spatially and thinking about where things are immigrating and emigrating from. So that's why I don't think there's a definitive answer, but I think you're right. I think it's sort of the conclusion is sort of suggesting that this really could have an impact. And I think we just need to look closer at it to be able to say that with certainty.
Right.
But it's
burning ticks is fun. So that's what you know, so.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, as we did mention this in this, you know, it's, I find ticks are often worse in these communities that are not getting burned. You know, there seems to be a higher incidency of them there. And then, you know, post-burn, we'll post-burn Muddy Brook, and it's all anecdotal, but it feels like there's a lot less afterward. So I think we just need to do more research, and it seems like a pretty straightforward hypothesis.
Yeah, okay. And I have another question. Are you familiar with William Cronin's book, Changes in the Land, and his discussion of Native people burning the woods?
I am. Yep, it's on the bookshelf right here. It's a classic.
Good.
Yes.
And another comment that was an excellent presentation. So.
Oh, thank you.
All right. If anybody else has any thoughts or comments or whatever, We appreciate it, and we thank Chris for doing this. This is, having done a couple of these webinar type things myself, but Mike Jones said it's like talking into a closet. You really have no idea whether anybody's still out there, but I really appreciate you taking the time, and again, we'll have this on the website and available and in an email out to everybody that participated. So I want to thank everybody, and I think we're pretty well set, and I wish everyone a good evening. And I got my moth light on, so I'm going to go out and see what showed up while we've been talking. So, all right. Well, thank you, Chris, very much, and we'll see you all at our next webinar, which will be next month with Wayne Peterson of Massachusetts Audubon. All right. Well, have a good night.
All right. Thanks, everyone.